our new material in front of so many experts of the area. So what we want to discuss today is this question whether there is something wrong about refusing COVID-19 vaccine. You certainly already have a view about that. So let's see whether we manage to either change your view or simply conform you in what you already think is true. So so I speak first and Sebastian will speak in a second time, yeah. But everything I say is something that he endorsed, isn't it? So I hope so. So our main motivation, I think that's important to say in the beginning, is in fact really this idea that we need to understand better what happens when people refuse the vaccine. So the idea is really to figure out, sorry, I forgot to share my handout. Sorry, it's something appears, I do that quickly. I apologize, where is it? Here. So now you can see my screen, yeah? Okay, so yeah, our main motivation was really this idea that we want to figure out, in fact, how to appropriately relate and engage refusers with people who refuse to take the vaccine. Yeah. And so the idea is not, and that's important, to castigate anyone. So we really don't want to just end up, having to say, oh, this is blameworthy. That's really not what we aim at doing, but more, to really understand what are the reason for doing this, and more precisely, whether this reason make them responsible for their beliefs that they should not get vaccinated, and whether these beliefs are rational or not. So our three main claims will be, because we will be in fact that they are responsible for their beliefs. That's one thing we want to show. Another thing we want to show is that they are in fact rational. So their beliefs of the vaccine refusal are rational. And what we also would like to do with you, that's more work in progress, is to consider the possibility that they might still commit another form of mistake. And now a quick word about the methodology. So what we want to do is first to describe what we think is a paradigmatic case of vaccine hesitancy. And in a second time, we would like to analyze this paradigmatic case with the tool of the contemporary theories of responsibility and rationality. A quick note too regarding what we mean by vaccine refusal or vaccine refuser. They are in fact the people that refuse to be vaccinated as a result of a belief that they should not get vaccinated. So if there is something wrong about what they do, it's not a matter of whether, they act badly, because in fact they do, if they have the belief that they should not get vaccinated, then it makes sense to not to receive the vaccine. So they are rational. So they behave empathetically, yeah? So that's not what we try to evaluate, because we assume that they are not irrational from this point of view. They are not irrational in the sense that they don't act rationally on the basis of what they believe. So the question is whether what they believe, so their cognitive attitude, is something for which they can be held responsible, and whether these beliefs themselves are rational. So this is just a note to make clear why, in fact, most of what we try to evaluate are cognitive attitude of the vaccine refusers and not their actions, because we assume that the action is the rational conclusion or rational consequence of what they believe is true about the world. So let me see whether I forgot to tell you something. So no, I don't think so. So as I say, we need to start in order to achieve this sort of evaluation regarding their rationality and their responsibility. We need to start by relying on empirical evidence about what seems to be the reason. So this is not something, of course, that we can do from the armchair to know why people refuse the vaccine. So in this part, we rely on the not so abundant literature on what are the reasons that the vaccine refusers say they have for refusing the vaccine. And so it seems that there is some sort of common view about that. So it seems that, in fact, and I just read out the quote here, that in every country for which there is data, people provide similar reason to refuse COVID-19 vaccination. And there are three kinds of those reasons. So the first kind are the reasons that have to do with the personal situation of the individuals. So very often people say, oh, I do not think I believe I should not get vaccinated because I do not need it, because I'm too young, for instance. And then come the reason that have to do with the effectiveness of the vaccine. So things like, given the high probability that the virus mutes, it's in fact quite pointless to be vaccinated. And a third kind of reason that are especially widespread, in fact, are the reasons that have to do with the lack of trust in the laboratories or the political establishment or the medical establishment. Yeah. So for instance, the side effects are unknown, the laboratories are in a logic of profitability, and so on and so forth. So on the basis of this list, we can build some sort of imaginary but very credible paradigmatic example of someone who is a vaccine refuser. And this is a quite long case because it plays a very important role in the argumentation. So that's why we spend some time thinking about this case and really building something that seems to be, that is credible. So this is Jean, the paradigmatic COVID-19 vaccine refuser. So this is our example, yeah. So let me read it loud. Jean, studied law and works in a law office. She lives in a European middle-sized city. Each morning, Jean reads the free newspapers she finds at the bus stop. She also follows the evolution of the pandemic by watching the national news every night, and she regularly discusses the topic with her husband and her many friends. When the vaccine was just made available to the population, she heard, like many of us, of the suspicion that injecting the vaccine might be correlated with a higher risk of thrombosis. Later, she was also informed via the media that this was not the case after all. During the entire vaccination campaign, but mainly at the beginning of it, Jean and her husband had many discussions as to whether they should be vaccinated or not, especially given the frequent visit of Jean's elderly mother. Over coffee with her friends one morning in January 2021, Jean said to them, "After having weighed the pros and cons, I now believe I should not be vaccinated against COVID-19 and won't therefore receive the vaccine. I'm healthy and in my early 40s. I prefer to be cautious and try not to catch this virus to receiving a vaccine about which I cannot be sure that it is innocuous. I am aware that many serious scientists say it's safe, but should I really believe what they say? After all, there have been many scientific errors in history, and I remind you that at the beginning of the pandemic, other serious scientists told us that masks were not useful. So I don't think we should always believe them." So this is the paradigmatic example we built. I hope this, remind you of some people and that you find it credible too. Why is it paradigmatic? Because if you look at the reason that genes give in order to, justify why she does not believe she should get the vaccine, they match, in fact, what seems to be, according to the studies, the most common reason why people believe they should not be vaccinated. So 1, 2, 3 on the handout. Yeah. So now, one main question is whether this is a belief she is responsible for. And so that's one thing we want to evaluate with Sebastian. And because it might sound obvious to some people, but it's not necessarily so obvious. And I think if we want to, really evaluate whether she's responsible for her belief or not, we need to rely on what I think are the two main accounts of doxastic responsibility, so responsibility for belief. They are the reason responsiveness account that has been defended by a lot of different people, but in this specific paper, I will rely on McHook's account, who I find especially convincing. and the kind of account that has been defended by Rick Peels and myself that say that we are responsible only indirectly for our beliefs. And so what I'm going to do now is simply to check whether, what are the results, which kind of result these accounts give us when we apply it, when we apply them to Jean's case. So first of all, there is this, so let me first present you kind of briefly the reasons responsiveness account. So this is this view that to be responsible for a belief if and only if you believe or your cognitive attitude in general is responsive, reasons responsive. Yeah. And then the question is, what makes a cognitive attitude a reasons responsive cognitive attitude? And according to Mahaku, a cognitive attitude, which is reasons responsive, satisfy two main conditions. And this is what you can find on your handout here. So the view is as follows. So cognitive attitude is reasons responsive, and this subject is thus responsible for it, only if in an alternative scenario in which the subject has sufficient reason to hold, not to hold this cognitive attitude or to hold simply another one, yeah, this subject will recognize a sufficient reason not to hold this cognitive attitude. And this is the condition of receptivity to other epistemic reasons. And not only it will recognize a sufficient reason to hold another cognitive attitude, it will also not hold this cognitive attitude for this reason. So he will change his mind. Yeah? And the second condition is called the condition of reactivity to epistemic reasons. So now the question is whether Jean's belief, do they satisfy these two conditions or not? So let me start with condition 2, because it's slightly simpler, I think, to see that her belief satisfies this condition 2. So the question is, would Jean hold a different cognitive attitude if she were to recognize a sufficient reason not to believe that she should not be vaccinated? So can we answer this question? Yeah. So to answer this question, I first need to clarify what will be a belief that violates this sort of condition. So beliefs that violate the condition of reactivity to reason are things that we might call alienated beliefs. So beliefs that you cannot revise no matter what you think is true. So no matter the amount of evidence you have that something is not the case, you keep believing that this is the case, even though you're aware that there are many reasons speaking against what you think is true already. So typically, some implicit beliefs or some prejudicial beliefs seems to be like that. So I don't know. I mean, I try to give a not too morally connoted or not too morally loaded kind of belief of this kind. So suppose I believe that Italian citizens are much more chaotic than Swiss German citizens. So that's, and suppose that I have like 100 of reason, especially in my group, to change this belief because I see how good, how well organized they are. And, but I cannot change my view about that because this is just not a belief that I control in any way. So, and that will be a case in which my prejudicial belief does not satisfy the condition of reactivity to epistemic reason. So condition 2 of the account. And the question is, can we compare Jean's belief to one of those prejudicial or alienated beliefs, such as the one I just described? And I think this is clearly not like this that she works. So the belief that she should not be vaccinated is not of this kind. So it's not an alienated belief, one she cannot revise because, say, for instance, it's so deeply entrenched in her psychology or is an essential, immovable part of it. So it's not that vaccine refusers, or at least paradigmatic cases of vaccine refusers, the belief they hold are not of this kind. They are not similar to implicit beliefs or prejudicial beliefs. So there is no reason to think that they cannot satisfy this condition two, the condition of reactivity to epistemic reason. So we have a first, so the beginning of a reason to think that perhaps they're responsible for their beliefs. But naturally, we still have to check whether they also satisfy this first condition, the condition of receptivity to epistemic reason. So now the question is, suppose there is an alternative scenario in which she has sufficient reason to hold a different cognitive attitude. Would she recognize this sufficient reason not to believe that she should not be vaccinated? And here it's a little bit more complicated, because clearly some of what we take to be sufficient reason not to believe that you should not be vaccinated. So things like, for instance, the fact that the vaccine has been administered to billions and billions of people, and that in the vast majority of cases, there were no bad side effects. So that seems to be a sufficient reason not to believe that the vaccine is dangerous. But it does not seem that, even though this is certainly a sufficient reason, and there is an alternative scenario, which is in fact very close, in which the vaccine refusers are aware of this fact, the fact that billions of people have been vaccinated, and there's no, in the vast majority of cases, there were no side effects. Even though there is this scenario in which vaccine refusers have cognitive access to this fact, still they are usually not moved by it. So they cannot recognize it as a sufficient reason at all. And so that's visible because in most of the campaign for the vaccination campaign has pushed this point a lot. And in fact, it had almost no effect on the number of vaccination. So it seems that some of the facts that are sufficient reason are not recognized as such. So we have to admit this. But the important thing to realize is that the condition of receptivity to epistemic reason does not require that the individuals recognize sufficient reason to revise their attitudes in all the alternative scenario in which they have sufficient reason to revise them. So it can be that they don't recognize some of the sufficient reason. What is important is that there is at least one scenario in which they have sufficient reason to revise their attitude, and in which they also recognize this as a sufficient reason. And in fact, we cannot rule out that there is such a scenario in the case of the vaccine refusers. Why? Because, that's, of course, also will need to be empirically more supported. But most of the time, if you ask them, if you ask the vaccine refusers, would you accept to take the vaccine in 15 years when we have more insight about the effects? Most of them say yes. So they say, oh yeah, in 15 years, that will be a different story. Because so that's sufficient to show that there is an alternative scenario in which they change their view. This is the alternative scenario in which there is much more evidence supporting the innocuousness of the vaccine. Yeah. So there is at least one scenario in which they would recognize a sufficient reason not to believe that they should not be vaccinated. So sorry for these double negations. That makes the things more complicated to understand, but in fact, it's not so complicated. So there is this alternative scenario. And this is very important because if we realize that there is at least one case in which they will change their view, this makes it clear. This, in fact, shows that we should not consider the vaccine refusers as, that we should not consider that she or he is just like a delusional person suffering from a very serious form of paranoia, for instance. So people who cannot recognize any reason to change their paranoid beliefs. So it's not like that. It's there is at least some scenario in which they will revise their view. Simply not in all of them, but that's not what we expect in order to hold people responsible. So while we cannot hold the paranoid person responsible for their beliefs because there's no alternative scenario in which she would change her mind, we can hold the vaccine refuser responsible for her beliefs. So people just like Jean, because there are scenarios in which they would recognize sufficient reason to hold another cognitive attitude. Let me double check how I'm doing with time. Okay, I think since I want to leave a lot of time to Sebastian too, I think I am going to skip the part about the indirect control influence account because it's not the most exciting part anyway. What I can tell you, we can discuss this in the Q&A if you like, but what I can tell you that in fact the conclusion is the same. So the conclusion of the application of the reason responsiveness account is that vaccine refusers are responsible for their beliefs, and the same can be said when we apply the indirect control account to the beliefs of the vaccine refusers. So now we can move to the question whether, now that we know they are responsible for the beliefs, whether these beliefs are rational. So I give the mic to Sebastian, and I stop sharing in the same time.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I have some voice problems here, but I think now it's good. So I start sharing the handout now to go to the rationality part. Can everybody hear me well? Can you just confirm that you hear me? Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay, great, really can hear me. Okay, so now that we have established that these people are responsible for their beliefs, we open the question for that, whether they can be praised or blamed or whatever. So now they're responsible, we can ask the rationality question. We use the term rational in such a way that if they are irrational, there's some sense in which they would be criticizable. But yeah, now we will argue that they are not criticizable in this sense. So the claim is that paradigmatic vaccine refusers like Jean, I hope I pronounce it correctly, I'm always not sure, are epistemically rational. That is, they do not violate any requirement of epistemic rationality in believing that they should not get vaccinated. So given their perspective is the argument, because rationality supervenes on the mind, so external facts are only relevant to rationality insofar as they are accessible to us, they do not commit any mistake that would make them criticizable in this rationality sense. So important is that we distinguish between different degrees of rationality. So one can just be irrational with having one belief, then only the belief is irrational, but the person is maybe not. One example would be believing irrationally that the beautiful stranger was definitely flirting with you, even though there were other people they could have smiled at. And so this would be one case where you have an irrational belief, and that happens to all of us. We are not like irrational persons just because we have one irrational belief. But then, of course, it happens that we are irrational maybe when it comes to a specific topic. So, for example, you might think that you're irrational if you dogmatically ignore scientific evidence for vaccine safety. And then whenever it comes to that topic, you tend to form irrational beliefs. In this case, we say you're locally character irrational. And then there's a stronger sense even in which you could be globally character irrational when you're just in general an irrational person who only believes what they desire to be true and so on. And we're quite sure that Jean is not like that. So she's not globally character irrational. Worst case, she is locally character irrational when it comes to the specific topic. So we can't deduce anything about her whole character here just from looking at this topic. So what we will do is basically now argue that her specific belief is not irrational. So she's not locally irrational in this respect. And so we can also conclude from that she's not locally character irrational. Okay, so one of the most prominent theories on rationality is coherentism. It states that to be epistemically rational, because we restrict ourselves to epistemic rationality here, is to have beliefs that fulfill certain coherence requirements of epistemic rationality. So in the standard formulations, they are the following, like consistency. If you believe that P, then do not believe that not P. And we see very quickly that she does not violate this just by believing that vaccines are not sufficiently safe, because she doesn't have like contradictory beliefs. It's not that she believes that they are safe and that they are unsafe. She doesn't have a divided mind like this or something. Then there's an evidence A requirement. So if you believe that you have sufficient evidence for P, then you should believe that P, or then believe that P. And it's also clear that she doesn't violate this, because I mean, she denies that there is sufficient evidence for vaccine safety. And so she's rational in believing that they are not safe, right? So she's rational in her disbelief. The evidence B requirement is the other famous requirement of theoretical rationality. If you believe that you lack sufficient evidence for P, then do not believe that P. And here it seems like, well, Jeanne believes that she has sufficient evidence for her refusal to believe, and so she's rational in this belief. So it seems like, at least given her perspective, this belief doesn't conflict with any other beliefs in any obvious way, at least. And so this gets us to the conclusion that she seems to be coherent. Okay, now we consider objections to just clarify this argument here. So one could think that her irrationality is just less obvious than you don't see it on the first view. And maybe she believes something that, like, scientists are not to be trusted, because she says something like they erred in the past. Although as an educated person, we would expect her to know that her own judgment is not superior to the scientist's judgment, right? She studied law, so she should have some knowledge about science and know that basically, the scientists are more reliable than she herself is. And so it seems like there might be some kind of inconsistency at some level here. But in reply, we say that implicit contradictions are no basis for rational criticism. So the first reason for this is that we all have a lot of implicit contradictions. Philosophy, for example, helps us to uncover them. So we all started out with a lot of inconsistent beliefs about morality, free will, and knowledge. Then we did philosophy, and we had a hard time to uncover all these implicit contradictions, and we managed to hopefully uncover some of them and have less contradictory beliefs now. But it doesn't mean that people who don't philosophy are all irrational and criticize. Second, we sometimes forget about something, then adopt beliefs that imply that P is false. So we sometimes have these contradictory beliefs without thereby being criticizable or irrational in any substantial sense. So, for example, you have a friend, Tom, who does not like cumin, and then you cook a delicious meal with cumin in it when you have invited a few friends, and you think, well, everybody will enjoy this delicious meal, but you just forgot that John doesn't like cumin, and now you have contradictory beliefs because you know he doesn't like cumin, but you just forgot about it, and so you're not irrational in this case, you just forgot. And I mean, one might finally say that there is something, Jeanne seems to be falling short of the ideal of rationality or something like that by having implicitly contradictory beliefs. But I mean, that's something that we all have. And I don't think that's just falling short of this ideal. It's very human and normal, and it's no basis for criticizing her. Otherwise, we would all be rationally criticized. And the second objection is then, well, if she has these implicit contradictions, even if she is not irrational for that, she should at least attend to her implicit knowledge about science and get rid of her implicit contradictions. In reply, we say that, well, directing your attention can require your time and energy. Not investing this time and energy, even though you believe that you should invest it, would be acratic, but we're assuming that Jeanne is not acratic. She's not making this time of this kind of mistake. So she believes that she does attend sufficiently to the relevant questions and invests enough time, like by reading newspapers and so on. We should note here that figuring out implicit contradictions takes a lot of time. As philosophers, we know this, and so it's no surprise that she still holds, and maybe she will be successful as long as she continues in inquiry and then revises her contradictory beliefs at some point and makes it more coherent, her belief system, in whatever direction. Now, finally, there's the view of reasoned responsivism about rationalism. We might just grant here that, okay, she might be coherent, but then we might still say that she does maybe not respond correctly to her reasons, right? So that might be another kind of mistake she commits. And here we just note that, well, even reasoned responsivism is about the reasons that we possess. So it cannot be just about any kind of reasons, because certain reasons that we have no access to. So if we are in a house and the house is on fire, but we don't know, then it's not irrational for us to stay in the house. It would be irrational to jump out of the house if we don't know that there is a fire. So only if we know that there's a fire, it would be rational for us to leave the house. And so only these possessed reasons that are within our perspective, they matter for evaluations of rationality. And so if we assume that Jean has this kind of distrust in the scientific community, then given that distrust, she just discredits certain sources. And this again might make everything coherent, or she might respond correctly to the reasons that she possesses at least. And as a final objection, one might say, but this distrust, it must be irrational because it manifests confirmation bias, right? So she's discrediting sources that disagree with her views. She only believes what she already, what fits with her other beliefs, and she gathers selective information and only remembers selectively. In reply, we say that confirmation bias is not always epistemically irrational, even though in psychological literature it's treated as a paradigm case of irrationality, but we think this is wrong, mainly because we all adopt beliefs that fit well with what we already believe, right? It's a paradigmatic case of rationality. It would be very irrational if we would only adopt beliefs that are in conflict with our beliefs. And so this feature does not seem to be a big problem in terms of rationality. And also selective information gathering or selective remembering can be rational when your resources are limited, basically. Yeah, and the distrust that she had, it can develop in certain echo chambers, and these are like structures where your own beliefs are constantly confirmed and where you don't really have access to other reasons. And in these cases, it's tragic, but you discredit reliable sources of knowledge that would provide you with knowledge if you would take them seriously, but you just don't. And I think this has implications. So first, we cannot say that Jean is like totally irrational. She's not like a modern Don Quixote or something like that. It is appropriate to engage with her in rational discussion. And it's important because if we don't engage with vaccine refusers, this would be could end up in an epistemic injustice because we might commit certain forms of intellectual myopia, overconfidence in our own judgments, and have overconfidence in our judgments concerning their rationality. And Kazam has a good paper on that. Furthermore, I think that if her refusal belief is rational, then we cannot change it just by making her aware of an internal incoherence or failure to respond to her reasons, because there is just no such failure. So we cannot just say, hey, look, you're irrational, and then it would vanish. So that just doesn't work. And we have to acknowledge, I think, that the roots of vaccine refusal go deeper into the societal structures of trust and distrust, which tragically cause people to rationally discredit reliable sources of knowledge. So I think public health policy should take this into account and focus on rebuilding trust between medical practitioners and medical patients. That's one of the main aims of them. So I now think Anne takes away the last part. Maybe I jump in. Let's see how it goes on. Okay,
so I will. So what we end up having is, it's clear that they seem to be rational and responsible, and so the question is whether there is something else going wrong with the fact that you received the vaccine. And so we tried with Sebastian to figure out different kind of hypotheses that will explain why some of us might have the intuition really that there is something wrong about not being vaccinated. And first of all, I would like to mention what I think are unpromising candidates to explain this wrongness, if there is any wrongness. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, that's also supported by empirical evidence, but we should not think that most of the vaccine refusers are free riders, that they free ride on herd immunity, because in fact, they don't usually try to take advantage of the fact that others receive the vaccine while they do not. And that is visible in the fact that most of, so many vaccine refusers spread, in fact, anti-vaccinations material. And that is visible. So this is something that, for instance, some studies supports. And of course, if they spread anti-vaccination material, that's not that they want us to keep being vaccinated while they free ride on this our immunity. Yeah. So this is not what they do in the wrong way. So one other hypothesis will be that they are bad inquirer, that they should, proceed to better inquiry. But most of the time, in fact, they are much better inquirers regarding this topic than many of the people who take the vaccine, who perhaps ask themselves less questions. So very often they read a lot of newspapers, they watch TV, they discuss the topic. So there is something like a passion about the truth regarding vaccines that develops by them very often. So these are not promising candidates to explain a potential additional wrongness in this behavior. So now Sebastian will quickly present you what we think are more promising candidates, why there might be something going wrong with this behavior. So I give you the floor again.
Okay, thank you. So the more promising candidates is like first we could say something like maybe they will do some kind of statistic mistake in the inquiry, even though they don't do any such mistake now. So we could say that, well, if she isolates herself in echo chambers, then Jean will basically not be in touch with the epistemic community anymore, and that's a bad thing. So it's important that she continues to engage with people who disagree with her, and conversely, that probably also implies that we should engage with people who disagree with us, and just to make sure that we don't get entrapped in these echo chambers. And I mean, this could be a blameworthy mistake if we like stick into our own epistemic communities where we are just constantly where our beliefs are just confirmed constantly, basically. And so if she stops inquiring and engaging with people with different opinions, that would be a problem. Now we can also modify the epistemic possible mistake she's made. She might become irrational if there's new evidence coming to her and she just does dogmatically not respond to that evidence, then she would become irrational. So I mean, there's at least this thing we could say. She has certain forward-looking duties to just make sure that she's not committing a mistake. Yeah, so she might, after accumulating some evidence through time, that would make her irrational if she doesn't revise her belief. The new evidence might require her to at least suspend judgment concerning the vaccine refusal. So there's some temporal component here in these two conditions. So even though the vaccine refusers might be rational at this point, there's the constant danger of becoming a poor inquirer or becoming irrational. Becoming irrational. Okay, and now I think Anne will conclude.
Yes, thanks, Sebastian. So now there is, of course, this other additional hypothesis you probably already have, which is in fact that she might display, in fact, unresponsiveness to moral reasons, not to epistemic one, but to moral reason, because after all, so the whole idea of being vaccinated is not necessarily only something you do for yourself, but also for the sake of others. And so you might think, that even though a weak partiality for your own well-being is fine, but you cannot simply only think about yourself. So you should, get vaccinated simply because you must be responsive to the moral reason that is to say the fact that being vaccinated helps protecting others. Yeah. So that will be like a moral way of understanding what is wrong with refusing the vaccine, even though that's a little bit tragic if you think about it. Like that means that you're rational in not taking it, you're responsible in not taking it, but still, for moral reason, you simply have to force yourself. So that's one way of understanding. Yeah. So as said, what is wrong about not being vaccinated. And so the take-home message maybe for people in charge of the public health communication is that they should, in fact, really encourage vaccine refusers to engage in inquiries, so to keep looking for evidence and to stay in touch with it. So through that, to stay in touch with their epistemic community, and that they should make them perhaps also more sensitive to these moral questions. Without, and that's important, presenting them as irrational or immoral or irresponsible in their decisions. And so that's it. I hope we still have time for the Q&A. Yes, we do. And thanks a lot for your attention.
Talk about abusing family ties. You guys are 10 minutes over the time limit. Great, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I'm sure we have lots of questions. Do you guys want to kick off? Or okay, we've already got some Other people from the Zürich family, Glenn?
Hi, thanks. It was a really great talk. I actually have a lot of questions because I'm not sure if I completely share the intuition, if you know, they were not rational. And maybe I shouldn't have gone first because I feel like I need to gather my thoughts a little bit. But okay, there was one thing that I found interesting, and it was in the part where it was about you know, why she's